Welcome all of you to today's Lunch and Learn session. Lisa Cohen is going to be speaking about, if I get it back on my screen again, I believe it's called Good Poems for Hard Times. Lisa had a very long, distinguished career teaching in both the public schools and in the private schools in the area, and she hopes to share some of her thoughts with us as we go through hard times. If you have any questions, please hold them until Lisa asks for them, and then she'll be more than happy to chat. Thank you.
Well, happy snowy afternoon, everybody. When Keith introduced me as having taught in the middle schools and the high schools, I should also mention that at one point in my very early career, I taught a college course as part of my master's degree at Boston University. And the amusing thing about that is, in my class was my high school English teacher. He was my student. And it was a class in romantic poetry as it happened, and I taught it as best I could. I was a graduate student on a fellowship. And every time I finished a lecture, I would notice him looking at me and trying to place me. Finally, one day he came up and he said, "What's your maiden name?" And I said, "Sonnethal, Lisa Sonnethal, Mr. White." He said, "Oh, you were my student." I said, "Yes." I said, "And you were the only teacher who ever gave me a minus after the A in English." So he looked at me with horror, but I was fair to him. I gave him an A without the minus, so, right. Turnabout is sort of fair play. Anyway, originally when I wanted to do something about poetry, Rabbi Resnick and Keith suggested maybe something in Hebrew or something biblical. And that's doable, except that I hate to do poems in translation. I think if you do a poem in its original language, you get a lot of stuff, a lot of meaning that you wouldn't get in translation. But there is something that we can learn from the Bible, and that is, from the Bible's point of view, poetry is a central kind of writing. It is important. From the Shirat Hayam, which Miriam sings when they cross the Red Sea, to a whole book of poetry, the book of Psalms, and assorted other songs and poems scattered through the Bible feels that poetry is a central method of communication. So I'm going to take my lesson from the Bible and say that poetry is a central method of communication of meaningful, intense emotion. I should also say that English teachers, although we teach poetry, we don't spend our long days reading poems all the time. But when I come across one that's lovely, I like to focus on it, think about it, and love to get a chance to teach it, which I don't get to do very much anymore. So what I thought I'd do is emphasize the fact that as we go through these poems, your reaction as a reader is just as important as my reaction. And since I'm going to be showing you some poems that I see differently now and these days from the way I saw them when I first learned them, I think it's appropriate to say, take a good look at them, even if they're familiar to you, and see if they say something to you now that they either didn't say to you then, or that say something to you which is not what your English teacher told you they were saying to you. Because I've had a lot of people say to me, "Oh, that's not what my English teacher said." But if you're reading good poetry and you're open to it, there could be more than one way to look at it, which doesn't always come out in a classroom, but it is a true thing. So I'm going to start out with a poem that everybody knows and everybody's studied. And we're on, aha. Okay, this is called Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. It's a Robert Frost poem. It's really deceptively simple. There aren't even very many words in it that are more than one syllable. And of course, it's about snow, and I think we are all at this moment in time experts on snow. The other thing that makes this poem seem very simple is that it rhymes, and it rhymes in a very simple way. So I'm going to read it because it's always good to hear a poem and see what it evokes in your mind. Okay. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds, the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. In fact, someone once said to me, this poem doesn't say what it says at all. It's full of hidden meanings, but I don't think the meanings are very hidden. First of all, if you look in the second stanza, they're talking about the darkest evening of the year. And I guess technically, we just had the darkest evening of the year, December 21st, the winter solstice, when there's less daylight than there is any other time in the year. But of course, I think since last March, we've all had probably more than one darkest evenings of the year. I think of the day when I found out that my daughter had COVID, or the day that I found out that my cousin had died of COVID. Those were the darkest evenings of my year. Okay, so we're talking about either a dark evening with no light or a dark evening where the speaker of the poem is going through some stuff. It's dark for him, okay? And yet he stops, he looks in the woods, he listens, and it's very peaceful in the woods. It's very quiet. Whatever tumult is going on in his mind is not happening in those woods. But by the last stanza, he realizes, I can't stand here and pretend that life is not going on. It's going on, and I have things to do. You can stop, you can listen, you can think about the darkness of your evening, but you've got to keep going. You've got to move. A lot of people have said that this poem is about thinking about death and suicide. I'm not sure it's completely that serious. I think it's about the fact that when something is really difficult for us, when something is really dark for us, we are allowed to spend some time listening, waiting, watching, looking in the woods, looking in the dark woods and thinking dark thoughts, but then you have somewhere to go. And so you have to go there. So I think it is a lovely and positive poem, but it's positive without ignoring the fact that life has bad stuff. It has dark days, physically dark days and emotionally dark days. And you can indulge that for a while, but then you're on your way. You know, pull that horse along, get to where you're going. It's really a very sweet poem. Not about suicide, sorry. Okay, this would be a good place to stop and see if anyone remembers this poem. Oh, I see you, Marty. Go. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I did. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Okay, it's very interesting to me, and maybe you can help me understand this better. A lot of this poem, for whatever reasons, deals with the horse. the second stanza and the third, it's giving some, I don't, how do you want to put it? Feelings or intelligence or something about the animals. There's some feeling there. At least
He's
that's
projecting, yeah, he's projecting
Yeah.
emotions into the animals.
Yeah, that's all. I just wanted to say that. I thought that was interesting.
It is interesting. Well, it's sort of, we know the horse
Yeah,
isn't having very deep thoughts, but if
No.
they go the same way every day, the horse probably does think, why is he stopping now? Because we've got to, I don't know what it is, deliver that milk, or we've got to deliver the mail, or whatever the next thing was.
yeah.
Um,
All right, just
I don't think it's the horse isn't very deep, but I guess it's more his projecting that he feels uneasy stopping, right? He wants to move, so now he's projecting that feeling onto the horse.
okay.
So it's a very good point, actually. Okay. Anyone else? I can't see all the hands, so if you want to say something right now, unmute yourself
Johnny.
and yell.
Johnny.
Go,
Johnny.
Charlie. No?
Yes,
It's Joseph. Can I say something? Oh, sorry.
I'm thinking like the stop and smell the roses thing. It looks beautiful. I'm stopping, but then I'm kind of busy. I have to go on with my work, with doing things. Toward the end, he or she has promises to keep, and I have to go. I can't just look at the beautiful snow and the beautiful forest because I'm busy. I have things to do.
Yeah, although literally there are no roses because it's the middle of the winter, but the idea is absolutely right. The snow is pretty, and I know yesterday, some of you probably, like I did when I went out to shovel, I said, oh, how beautiful the snow looks. And then I said, and now I have to shovel it. It's not so beautiful when you have to shovel it. Yeah,
That's kind of, yeah.
good, good, good.
Lisa, can I ask you a question?
Please.
So what do you, putting aside the content, what do you make of the fact that the rhyme scheme, so you have A, B, A in each
Yeah.
verse, and yet the B in each verse serves as a precursor to what the rhyme scheme is going to be in the next.
Yeah.
In the sense that you have the third line of the first phrase ending in the word here, and then here serves as the next rhyme scheme in queer, near, and year in the second verse.
Well,
And
at
then
this time, at this time in Frost's career, he set some very difficult challenges for himself when he sat down to write. There is a name, that's a Spencerian rhyme scheme. It's in iambic tetrameter. It's all of the formatic things are very complicated. And if you can make it sound like natural human language and yet fit into the rhyme scheme and fit into the rhythm scheme, that's the sign of an extremely gifted poet. Now, you could write a poem with that rhyme scheme and rhythm, and it would sound childish and silly, but somehow he doesn't. He's probably the last of the poets who can use rhyme, much less complicated rhyme, and make it sound adult. Much more common in modern poetry is to make it blank, that means unrhymed, and very often not even with a rhythm pattern either. That's where modern poetry has gone, because it's very hard to do it the way Frost does here and not have it sound like for children. So, yes. Anyone else waving? Because we're gonna move on.
Yes, I would like to say something.
Okay, go.
Okay. Years ago, I heard someone talk about this on the radio who had interviewed Frost and asked him about the poem. And there were all sorts of different meanings attributed to the poem. And he said, no, it was just a poem about nature. And literally what it said, there wasn't much, this is what he said, there wasn't, he didn't try to put any hidden meaning into the poem.
Well, there is no hidden meaning. I mean, if we can find it, it's not hidden, but I should tell you that Frost was famous for saying that about almost any poem that he wrote. If someone asked him what it meant, he said, it means what it says. You don't have to analyze it. I mean, there's a poem he wrote called The Death of the Hired Man,
Yes.
where there's it's a poem about a terrible accident where the hired man who is working on some lumber actually cuts off his hand and bleeds to death. And people said, well, what does it mean? And he said, it has no meaning, but of course it has meaning. It has meaning about the fragility of life. And it has meaning about how you should take care when you use your rotary saw. I mean, it has all sorts of meanings, but if you asked Frost, he would always say, it has no meaning except what is there. I think he liked making fun of people who looked deeply. But anyway, as I say, many people say this poem is about suicide. I'd say that's carrying it a little too far, but it certainly is about how you keep going no matter what's going on in your life, because that's what you do. Okay.
Lisa, when did he write the poem?
This is, it's very early. I think 1918.
1980. It's very
It's very early. It's one of the first he wrote. I could look it up. I should look it up.
No, it's fine. It's very interesting because as you read the poem, I
Yeah.
saw a different image in my mind. And this reminds me of the stories that Shalom Aleichem wrote about Jews traveling in the forest, also with a horse and a wagon like Tuvia, and stopping, talking to God, but then realizing that he has to move on, as you said. So it's very interesting. And I think Shalom Aleichem and the other Jewish authors also wrote in the beginning of the century stories about forests. So I thought it was interesting.
Well, it's certainly a poem by someone who thinks that nature is much more important than cities, right?
Yes.
Someone
yes.
who's lived in nature, who experiences nature, and that, the world has changed in many ways, but
Yes.
he's a poet of rural Vermont. So, all right.
Yeah.
So I'm going to move on to another poem, which, well, first I'll give it credit to my mom. It's two stanzas here. This was one of my mother's favorite poems, and it was taught to me as a nature poem. But again, I'm not absolutely sure that that's all that is there. So before I read the poem to you, I would like you to think of a place that you go to in your mind when it's just getting too much for you in the current world. What location? Maybe Robert Frost would go to his forest and look at his forest for a while. Or maybe when I do this in high school, kids say, oh, I want to go to camp. I want to be at a bonfire, or I want to go to my grandma's house and help her bake apple pie. And this poem talks about that technique. So let's just look at the poem and then we'll talk about how you use the place you love in your life, okay? Such a famous poem. I always taught it in the spring. In the Brandeis School, we had a big plot of daffodils right in front of the door. And I would take the kids out of the front door and we'd sit among the daffodils. All right. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of the bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not be but gay in such jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. So what William Wordsworth is doing here is he is using a beautiful moment that he has experienced. He's using it for the rest of his life. If you look in that last stanza, often he uses it to make himself happy. He takes something he remembers and uses it to fill up time that is not happy. When on his couch he lies in vacant or in pensive mood, the image from his mind flashes on his inward eye. And so, although this is a poem about nature, it talks about how human beings use memory to keep themselves going, to keep themselves balanced, to keep themselves involved. It's really a poem about how the mind works, the power of your mind to overcome any temporary mood, okay? I always think there's a little joke in here too. If you look at the second to last stanza, where he says, a poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. And I always think that's amusing because he could have said a person, it would fit the meter, but he's saying, well, you know, maybe it's me. Maybe because I'm a poet, the thing that I remember is these dancing daffodils. But as I said, any human being, if you sit down and think, you have done what happens in this poem. You have picked an image from somewhere in your life, somewhere in your past. It's come into your mind, you've meditated on it, and it makes you happy, whatever it is. And so while it's about daffodils, it's also about the power of the human mind to make itself strong, the power of creativity to make itself happy. So I love this poems. And if he was, you know, if he danced with another flower, it wouldn't matter because, as I say, it's about the mind and what it can do for you. Okay, so did everyone think of a place where they were, a place they go back to when they want to, I don't know.
I thought of one that's always in my mind, the
What, Marty?
beautiful stars at Lake George in the evening on a summer's night.
Oh, how lovely.
That is just incredible.
Right. And so when you think of it, it gives you the feeling all over again. Okay. Sometimes it is from traveling. Is there anyone who's traveled and thinks of a place that they were, whoops, sorry about that, a place that they were that gives them that happy, contented, pleased feeling? Alas, I think sometimes good meals I remember that way. But okay, if you think of a meal, it doesn't have as many calories, by the way, as it does when you're actually eating it. Okay.
So Lisa, I went on US Wine Wheels in 1974,
Uh-huh.
and we went to the Grand Canyon, and that was a
Wow.
pretty impressionable moment where decades and decades and decades later, I went with my wife and kids, and on Christmas Day, forced them to wake up when it was maybe 5 degrees outside to see the sunrise, because that's what I did when I was 14. And that was one of the more serene, awe-inspiring places that even after 40 something years, still inspired, was still inspirational and still very comforting and awe-struck.
And you wanted to share it, and now your whole family has the same image that they can
Right. I'm not sure it was the same as like waking up on a warm day in July at 14, but nevertheless, yes, they now have that memory, which might get passed down.
You bring up an interesting thing, Rabbi, that I didn't mention about the poem, but you notice everything in this poem is about the single person. He's not sharing the way you shared. He's not sharing his feeling except in the poem. He doesn't bring people with him, and that's true of a lot of the romantics. They enjoy the beauty of nature, but they enjoy it alone. And then they share it in the poem, but they don't share it in their lives. So that's why we get the image of, at least romantic poets, as individual men, rarely women, individual men wandering around the fields, writing poems about things they see.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. Okay, let's move on to this one. I like this one. It's short, but again, it's about something that can be helpful. Tour, we've all been on tours. So this is someone who's on a tour and she's telling you what happened. Near a shrine in Japan, he'd swept the path and then placed camellia blossoms there. Or we had no way of knowing, he'd swept the path between the fallen camellias. I love this poem because if you've ever taken a tour, sometimes you look at something and you think you know what's happening, and that's not what's happening at all. So your guide tells you something, you say, oh my goodness, I didn't know that that was happening. Or I didn't realize the completeness of what was happening. And I thought of an example this morning, before Corona. If you remember, there was a time before Corona. My husband and I were in Nepal, and we were at the Great Stupa, S-T-U-P-A, that's a Buddhist temple. We were at the Great Stupa in Nepal, and there were people walking around the stupa, and they had these, I guess you'd call them prayer wheels, but you turn them back and forth on with your wrist, and they have plumes that spin out in a circular motion. And we thought, well, that's an interesting way to worship. But our guide pulled over one of the people and he said, well, that is walking around as many times as you can and holding this prayer wheel thing is a way to worship. He said, but there's a lot more going on here. He said, because this worship has been forbidden in communist China. And in Tibet, it is considered an extraordinarily brave and important religious activity to sneak out of Tibet, get to Nepal, and perform this religious activity, walking around the stupa, walking around the temple, which is something you can't do anymore in Tibet, which is now part of communist China. And in fact, a lot of them were carrying pictures of the Dalai Lama, which has nothing to do with Buddhist worship and everything to do with civil disobedience against the communist Chinese who have taken over in Tibet. So we thought we were seeing a very pretty scene of people worshiping. And what we were seeing was a strong, if understated, rebellion against the communist Chinese, hatred and anger. And it wasn't, when you talk to the people, it wasn't pretty at all. So I'm wondering, did anyone have that kind of experience ever on a tour where they learned that what they were looking at was not what they thought it was?
I wanted to ask you a question about this, if it's okay. I get a feeling here that someone's sweeping the paths, but then we don't know, but then it's between what was falling, the camellias anyway, that life just keeps going on. I get something like that relating to this poem. I don't know if I'm on track or way off on it. That's how I got.
No, I think that's interesting. I mean, clearly there are more than two ways actually to look at what was happening. Maybe it's against the rules to touch the fallen camellias. We don't know that. So maybe he has to sweep around them. You know, like the Jain religion, they're not allowed to sweep because you might disturb insects, and they're not allowed to kill insects. Yeah, the message is you don't know. You may never know. In fact, even what the guide tells you may not be true. So, yep, you may never know. But I think it's also about life, right? Because everything is always about life. You don't always understand what you see, okay? It is always awaiting further explanation, especially when you deal with things that people do. What you think their motivation is may not be the motivation at all. And so it's always good to be wary and wait for the person to tell you the motivation, not to make up your mind beforehand. It's a cool poem, very cool. Students love this poem because they always say, Mrs. Cohen, you say I didn't do my homework, and I didn't do my homework last time, and I'm just not doing my homework because I'm not trying hard, but that's not the reason. And then they would tell me some story which was possibly true, but maybe not. Okay. Okay. I don't know if anyone out there is a lover of puzzles. There. But this, I like to imagine this being about my daughter as she tries to do her full-time job as well as making sure her two children are on their Zoom school in a house, in a 3-bedroom apartment where her husband also is working. But anyway, it's a crossword puzzle. It's a puzzle. We put the puzzle together piece by piece, loving how one curved notch fits so sweetly with another. A yellow smudge becomes the brush of a broom, and 2 blue arms fill in the last of the sky. We patch together porch swings and autumn trees, matching gold to gold. We hold the eyes of deer in our palms, a pair of brown shoes. We do this as the child circles her room, impatient with her blossoming, tired of the neat house, the made bed, the good food. We let her brood as we shuffle through the pieces, setting each one into place with a satisfied tap, our backs turned for a few hours to a world, whoops, oh, sorry about that, to a world that is crumbling, a sky that is falling, the pieces we are required to return to. I really love this because it makes a contrast between people who are successfully putting together a kind of complicated puzzle, but they're doing it in a world that is completely disorganized and chaotic. Their child can't stand the fact that they're doing this puzzle because the child is being ignored. And they realize that they can do to the puzzle what they can't do to the world, which is make it right, make it neat, make it perfect. So what can I say? Life is like this crossword puzzle, like this floor puzzle. It's easier to put the pieces together of a puzzle than it is to make sense out of life itself. It's easier to do the puzzle than it is to take care of the little girl who doesn't like everything neat. But the parents just take this 1 minute to make everything organized and perfect. That minute when you finish a puzzle and it looks perfect, it was a mess, it was pieces, and now it's beautiful. Okay. I thought this poem, as I say, felt a lot like life. because life is hard these days and puzzles are easier than living. Do we have any puzzle doers out there? I'm terrible at puzzles, but I appreciate people who can do them quickly and easily. Yeah.
Actually, I happen to have 2 puzzles in the house. And back in the spring, I said, let me do these puzzles. I put them together and I used the Mod Podge and I glue them. And finally, just recently, I hung them in my basement. And it's nice when I go downstairs and I see them. They both have to do with nature. And I never really did puzzles before, but it was a good feeling.
And that's it, yeah, and it gives you a feeling of accomplishment. And of course, now that you used glue, right, they can never
Yes.
fall apart again. Wouldn't it be nice if we could do that with everything? That's a good example, Barbara. I like that. Okay.
When I was growing up, every year between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we always did a jigsaw puzzle in my house. My dad would set up the bridge table and he'd buy a new puzzle. And that was a family thing that we all looked forward to. And for some reason, it just became something that happened at the time of the new year. Never did it any other time of the year.
That's interesting because, of course, that means in your house, they did it differently than they did in this poem, right? Here, the parents do not incorporate the children in this. They could have. Would take a lot of patience, I think, right? But
Yeah.
probably your way is better.
About that, but it was, you know what? It's something that, we'll never forget. So that was a good memory.
It's lovely. It is a lovely memory.
Lisa,
Yes, sir.
do you think that it struck me that the way the lines are broken seems somewhat arbitrary or random? And I was wondering if you think that that is meant to represent the various, a jumble of pieces that, look kind of disjointed until you actually read it together. And it's like by reading it, you're putting the puzzle together into a finished unit that has more meaning than it did as individual lines.
Oh, I think you are 100% right, Harold. And I would think you must have been trained by an extraordinary high school English department that was at least as good as the Hewlett High School English department, right? But not only are the lines broken in arbitrary ways, but they're even broken in awkward ways. In other words, usually when you're saying a long sentence, you will pause at certain places during the sentence, but those are definitely not the places that she broke these lines, okay? The breaks are not only in the puzzle, but the breaks are in the sentences. And that was so good, Harold. If she were still alive, I would tell B. Jaffe immediately. B. Jaffe is one of Harold's former teachers who I had the pleasure of knowing. Okay, here we are. This could be one of my all-time favorites, but again, it has a lot to say about attitude, the kind of attitude you need to keep going in your life. So you have to imagine, if you've ever taught someone to swim, you won't have to imagine it, but you have to imagine teaching someone to swim, getting them into a pool or the ocean for the first time and trying to get them to float, the beginning of learning how to swim. Okay, in this poem, it's a father, I think it's a father to daughter. It could be a mother to daughter, but we'll never know. Lie back, daughter. Let your head be tipped back in the cup of my hand, gently, and I will hold you. Spread your arms wide, lie out on the stream and look high at the gulls. a dead man's float is face down. You will dive and swim soon enough where this tide waters ebbs to the sea. Daughter, believe me, when you tire on the long thrash to your island, lie up and survive. As you float now, where I held you and let go, remember, when fear cramps your heart, what I told you, lie gently and wide to the light year stars, lie back, and the sea will hold you. So it's a good lesson, right? When you're tired, when you're first learning, lie on your back and learn to float. It's better than floating on your face because you can lie back and float for an unlimited amount of time, whereas lying face down, you won't be able to, okay? And the first half of the poem, it is pretty specific about learning to swim. But then right in the middle of the poem where he says, daughter, believe me, when you tire on the long thrash to your island, lie up and survive. Okay, he's talking now, I think, more about, as they say, it's about life. As you float where I held you and let go, remember when fear cramps your heart, what I told you. Lie gently and wide to the light year stars, lie back, and the sea will hold you, okay? So better than getting hysterical, better than worrying, better than being tense, lie back. And the sea, nature, world, the life will hold you, okay? Don't get hysterical. Don't get tense. Let your mind relax and it will be better. This poem is well known in my family because this particular attitude, the lie gently and wide to the light year stars, lie back and the sea will hold you. This is my son's attitude. He has never let anything upset him. He always says, relax, we will handle it, time will help us. Meanwhile, everyone else in the family is running around like chickens without heads, nervous and hysterical. Eventually, we learn to say, what would Paul do? And we try to think about what he would do, and that calms us down. So this is about learning to swim, and it's about learning to deal with things that are difficult. And it's a sweet poem. I'd love to know anyone's comments on it, whether you've taught someone to swim or whether the lying back and the sea will hold you appeals to you as an option. Or not.
The only thing that I'll mention, Lisa,
Yeah.
is that as I was reading this, I was reminded, and maybe Rabbi Resnick can speak more about it, not to take away your podium, but that the Talmudic adage is that your only obligation as a parent is to teach your child how to swim.
Yeah, Rabbi Schlesinger said something about that, I remember. And because I guess this poem would say you have to teach a child how to swim, not only from the safety point of view, but also from the point of view that learning how to swim teaches you to trust the natural world and your interaction with the natural world. Yes,
Yeah,
I love that, Stephen.
I think that the swim thing is kind of interesting, but my takeaway from here is a lot more than just the swim piece. It's just being able to kind of breathe deeply and realize that things will get better and have an optimistic kind of attitude on things. Like the very first line, let your head be tipped back in the cup of my hands and having the whole relationship of not just of a parent, but any loved one. And I'll extend it to the support of the community, that having that kind of support with you will go very, very, very far. Maybe not exactly what he meant, but poets write poetry and then they get analyzed in 100 different ways, and nobody's right, nobody's wrong in the future.
Oh, I think that fits 100%, Rob. I mean, we talked about I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, where he was definitely alone. This is definitely a family. This is definitely something that happens between people. So I think you're very right.
Between family and extend that, Lisa, one step to community.
Right. Right. Okay, good. I don't think we're going to do this one today because we'll be at it for hours. And besides, but if you ever want to look at it, it's a wonderful one about ecology. And the last wolf is literally the last wolf and the last person alive on earth. But I think we'll end with the bagel because I feel that that's a good way to end. I love this poem. And in some ways, it's like First Lesson. And it has magical realism in it. Little magic goes on there. And it's happy. And again, it teaches an attitude that helps in hard times. Okay, so the bagel. I stopped to pick up the bagel rolling away in the wind, annoyed with myself for having dropped it, as if it were a portent. Faster and faster it rolled, with me running after it, bent low, gritting my teeth, and I found myself doubled over and rolling down the street head over heels, one complete somersault after another, like a bagel, and strangely happy with myself. So you can see what I mean about the magic. Okay, he turns into, I guess, a gymnast and doing somersaults down the street following his bagel. Now, that didn't happen. It's magical. But what is this about? Well, it starts out with, he dropped a bagel. And if you look, if you look at the 5th line, he says, for having dropped it as if it were a portent, okay? So that's a portent is a sign of something to come, usually something bad to come, okay? So he messed up. He dropped a bagel and he's upset, and it was a bad thing to do, and he's got to get that bagel, okay? So he follows the bagel and he's gritting his teeth, and it's not a good situation. But as he follows the bagel, he becomes sort of, what would we say, playful, okay? And he imagines himself, I guess that's the only way you can account for it, he imagines himself doubled over and becoming sort of bagel-shaped, following his bagel, and happy. So in the poem, he moves from being upset and annoyed to happy. But there is no particular reason why he became happy, except what? He realized the situation of running after a bagel was kind of silly. He realizes a bagel is nothing to rip your heart out over. I don't know for sure, but what I do know is this poem tells you about how attitude can change your whole experience of almost anything. If you lose a bagel, you can be miserable. You can be angry. You can grit your teeth, or you can be happy. You can keep running after the bagel and think of it as something kind of amusing. And the only difference is how you look at it. Okay. So,
you know what comes to mind here when I've heard this, when one door closes, and then and so many things that you can possibly relate to in life and experiences, where that's so true.
Right. Yeah. You can lose a bagel and you can stay in the house of misery, or you can open the door and say,
Find
God,
much
this is silly, right? And it's amusing, and I'm not going to be miserable. But it is important to get that bagel right, because without a bagel, what are we? Anyone else with a bagel comment? A somersault comment? Okay.
Actually, the only comment that I ask, Lisa, is that when you wind up teaching, you are speaking to a specific audience. The audience that we have here are people, let's call it in their retirement age. No offense to anyone. And their view, and I'm not just talking about the bagel, I'm talking about anything, is based on their own experience and their own sense of having gone through life with certain things that happen that don't necessarily happen to someone who's 5 years old or 10 years old or 15 years old. How, as a teacher, you find yourself adjusting your teaching method based on who the pupil is, who the listener is?
Well, it's not so much that the questions are different, but that the answers are different. For instance, in this, if you say to a student, we're going to talk about the idea that if you change your attitude, you can make something bad seem better. Okay. Let's think of a situation where you gave advice to a friend of yours who is going through something very difficult, failed a test, and you say, well, you can be miserable with this, or you can look at it as a chance to study and do better on the next test. And you end up with the same thing. Kids are really very good at picking up this kind of stuff. Kids, very young kids, 10-year-olds, which is about as low as I've gone, love stopping by woods on snowy evening. Their attitude is leave the horse behind, go into the woods and have a snowball fight. And so the teacher says, well, what if the horse wanders away? What if you don't get home in time for dinner? And it all comes out to the same place, Stephen. Human experience, differs to some extent, but poets tend to intensify emotions that are very common, and kids tend to understand them. I'm looking to see if there's anything here I didn't teach in middle school, and no. Well, maybe that one. Break, the one about the puzzle, that one is definitely a sort of parent-oriented poem. But in general, kids are really good at that, Stephen. They really are.
And to give a not English teacher's perspective, but a rabbinic perspective from the Talmud, there's an expression we call Talmidai Lamadati, that from all my students I learned much. And teaching the same kind of text to young kids, older people, retired people, any kind of people, I always walk away feeling that as much as I might have given or prepared or learned, I really got more out of it as a teacher from learning from my students, because everyone comes with a bit different perspective, which even definitely happens more when you teach adults, because there's a lawyer, there's a doctor, there's a business person, there's an artist in the classroom. But when you teach kids, so there's somebody who comes from a divorced family, there's somebody who comes from a family with 2 moms or 2 dads, or poor or rich, and a well-constructed dialogue and conversation, you can really learn, as a teacher, you can really learn a lot.
Very true. Okay, and it is a thing I miss. But well, before the pandemic, not teaching meant that I could actually do other things and see my friends and hug the grandchildren more and all that. It's been a little quiet since COVID, but well, I appreciate this opportunity. I love to teach.
Thank you, Lisa.
My pleasure.
Lisa,
you.
if I can make one
Wonderful.
comment, when Rabbi
Wonderful.
Resnick and I were discussing what topic for you to speak about, I said at the very end, let her talk about what she wants to talk about. It'll be a better speech. And I believe I was right about that. Thank you very much for an excellent talk.